It was so cool to see those movies from the 1980s.
Yeah, and Ghostbusters was even funnier.
We should travel to the 1960s too and check out the movies from that era. One of the big sci-fi movies of the 1960s was Planet of the Apes. Let's check it out.
What happens in it?
Human astronauts travel to a planet where apes are the dominant species. This follows an often portrayed theme in sci-fi movies of the time, where humans have to interact with a unique species.
How bizarre.
Now, let's take a look at sci-fi movies from the 1980s.
What kind of sci-fi movies did they have in the 80s?
In the 1980s, sci-fi movies became more about the technology. In Back to the Future, the entire movie is focused on a car that can time travel, like we're doing now.
Watch this.
Well, horror movies in the 60s were cool too. Movies back then focused more on probable killers like crazy people just stabbing normal people with a knife. This played off of the distrust the American society had with itself due to the Cold War.
Wow.
Horror movies of the 80s were a little different. They focused on killers, but often incorporated more elements other than having a normal psycho.
What do you mean?
Many horror movies had more supernatural elements to them. They also incorporated sci-fi, and most often there would be a horror comedy here and there. As the fear of the Cold War slowly went away from American society, they started to fear things that were much more fantastical rather than real. Like in the movie Fly, where a man accidentally mixes his DNA with that of a fly.
Horror really did change a lot, huh?
It sure did. The change in special effects technology made things like monsters and gore more realistic. Like the movie I was talking about earlier. Look at it on my phone.
Wow, that was traumatizing.
Horror movies took advantage of this, as horror movies in the 1960s had much more gore in them.
Movies really were different from those two time periods.
Yeah, I agree. But it's safe to say that they're much better than movies in similar genres today.
Zombie.
Hey, where are we?
These hairstyles, the clothing, children running everywhere, I think we're in the 60s.
Parenting here in the 60s looks different than what we're used to.
Wow, this is so weird. Many parents let their kids walk to and from places alone. Kids were so much more independent and acted completely different.
I saw kids are going to the nearest playground without their parents being worried about where they are. Kids are also walking to school and to friends' houses without their parents.
Safety does not seem as big of a deal to parents in the 60s. Kids ride bikes without helmets, riding cars without seatbelts, and sitting in the back of pickup trucks. All these unsafe toys are given to kids as gifts. I see kids with fake guns and sharp darts. This can't be safe. In the 60s, smoking was a popular pastime. People are not aware of the consequences that come along with the cigarettes.
Here in the 60s, you see pregnant women smoking and drinking. Parents smoke around their kids, causing large amounts of secondhand smoke.
In the 60s, family will eat much more home-cooked meals such as lasagna and meatloaf due to the fact that there are many stay-at-home moms who have the time to cook for their families.
There aren't many kids around when the cartoon channel is on. That's because TV is one of the most popular pastimes. Over 90% of these households have TV sets.
Where are we now?
Based on the looks of the people, we're in the 80s.
Many of the things that parents did in the 60s seem to have carried on into the 80s.
This idea of parents letting their children be independent and go places alone carried into the 80s. But eventually, parents started getting more worried about where their kids were and what they were doing.
In the 80s, some of these safety hazards continued, but also rules got stricter to keep people safe. Seat belts started to become a necessity in cars, and helmets were used more.
In the 80s, you can see parents still smoking around their families and even smoking in their cars with the windows up while driving their children around.
There were also some differences from the 60s to 80s. In one way, it was how the parents ran their homes. Meals became different in the 80s, where food from containers became popular, which is also known as TV dinners.
3 pieces of batter-dipped chicken, fried crisp and golden, fluffy whipped potatoes, tender sweet vegetables, and apple cake cobbler for dessert. What's your guess? About $2? $2.50? Wrong. It's about 85 cents, and it's a Swanson fried chicken dinner. That's some value.
In the 60s, 84% of the population lived in households headed by a married couple, consisting of parents, children, and other relatives. This is down now in the 80s. This is leading to parents not having time to cook as many meals and their children having to become more and more independent. A new generation is being called the latchkey kids due to the fact that they often come home to an empty house.
Video games such as Pac-Man have taken over nowadays, and more kids are going to arcades as a result.
Parents have even less control on their kids now.
Wait, I feel something. I hope this sends us back home.
Whoa, where are we? Oh my gosh, I love your pants.
Thanks. I found them in the 60s, and I think we're in the future. It's 2019. I'm from the 60s. My time period has popularized the flowy, careless look, which, just by guessing and seeing what you're wearing, greatly contrasts with your style. Where are you from?
I'm from the 80s, but you're so right. We are all about going artificial. Updo hairstyles and bright or neon colors is all the rage. The motto for fashion in the 80s is go big or go home. Now that's what I call groovy.
What? I'm sorry, I don't do that. Yes, you do. I know. Come on.
The anti-war effort and the big push to step away from a conformist culture resulted in a massive hippie uprising. The hippies rose to popularity as a counterculture youth movement. We created our own communities and began what we refer to as a sexual revolution. We immersed ourselves in drug culture and made the usage of psychedelic drugs and marijuana a large part of our lives. Spiritual release is our thing. You can see this translated into our fashion through bright colors and intricate patterns.
I want to tell ya, it's coming from the center. Oh, can't you see? It's so simple to be free.
Where am I? Wait, I recognize this place. I'm at the Monterey Pop Festival. But this took place like 50 years ago. I must have time traveled to 1967. Wow, that's really cool. I freaking love this time period. Everyone is so free. I wonder if the Beatles are here. Wait, I think I see them over there. Back when the Beatles were beginning to become popular, many parents believed that the music was corrupting the children. Parents were used to jazzy artists like Frank Sinatra and Doris Day. Lyrics in the song were never too controversial, never enough to stir up the political pot like the 1960s were. Songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, Help, and Happiness is a Warm Gun was the spark for the nonconformist movement. My favorite member was Ringo Starr because he was strangely political and set away from the societal norms. Other 60s artists that were not too popular with the parents were the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones were very politically progressive and brought a new sound of music to the table, making them wildly popular with the youth. Both of these bands were pioneers of the nonconformist movement and made a path for disco classic rock 70s. Hey Megan, where are you?
Oh my God, I think I'm at Woodstock. Oh my God, it's Jimi Hendrix.
What? No fair. Well, I'm just going to stick around and watch Bob Dylan play a little bit longer, but I'll meet you in the 80s.
Have fun, I'll be in Woodstock. Woodstock is known to be one of the most popular music festivals of all time. It began in 1969 and is still going on today. Famous artists included Michael Jackson, The Who, and Carlos Santana. The Who greatly influenced the entire genre of rock and made the world go crazy over his one-of-a-kind music. The Who touched the lives of all Americans, including the parents of the non-conforming youth. The Who was known to be one of the original hardcore rock bands. They infected the population with their rock music and angered the older generations. However, we can't forget about the absolute genius that is Carlos Santana. The spectacular and unique way he shredded his electric guitar stunned his audience. His Mexican heritage also put him on track for diversifying the music industry. Look, there he is now playing Soul Sacrifice. But I would have to say that Michael Jackson had the biggest effect on music in the 70s. His stunning vocals and fashion-forward style led the way through the pop genre. America, along with the rest of the world, could not get over him. The 70s was a soft transition from the previous decade, and many of the issues present carried on into the 70s. However, the 70s became more chill, and instead of America's youth caring about every injustice in the world, they were done and only wanted to rock out and dance. They were tired of fighting politics and began a life of disco and drugs. What a time to live. Daniel, I think I'm ready to head over to the most crazy decade yet, the 80s.
Oh boy.
Oh my God, look at all these colors.
The 80s are so bright. Where even are we?
I think we're at, oh my God, we're at Live Aid.
You mean where Queen, Elton John, David Bowie performed in 1985?
Yeah, the 80s was a time for everyone to enjoy, and when some of the most iconic songs and films were released. By the 80s, disco had died and a new genre of electric music and heavy metal was taking center stage. Songs started to sound less like instruments and more like a computer, which mirrored the increase in technology around the world.
Queen played what is known to be one of the greatest performances of all time and proved that all audiences of all orientations can love any type of music. Queen was known for their extravagant songs and combining new ways to create sounds. Songs like Bohemian Rhapsody, Another One Bites the Dust, and We Will Rock You. One of their earlier albums, A Night at the Opera, was praised and criticized for their wide use of ranges and operatics. Queen produced 6 #1 singles and created a lasting impact on generations to come.
Ugh, I love Queen so much. You know who's better though? Elton John.
No way.
Yes, he is. Unlike Queen, he had 7 #1 songs and is way more original. Famous songs of his include Benny and the Jets, Tiny Dancer, and Rocket Man. Like Queen, Elton John opened a bridge for original artists to express themselves however they want. Overall, the 80s were accepting the new contemporary music and media. The parents of the youth, we all use more accepting of the way the younger generations wanted to live their lives.
I think we did a pretty good job summing up the 60s through 80s in a musical perspective.
Thanks for watching.
Well, shake it up, baby. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. You can't tell by the way I use my walk. I'm a woman's man. No time to talk. Music loud. With me more being kicked around since I was born. Her name is Rio and she dances on the sand.
Oh, where are we?
I don't know. Maybe if we look around, we can find out where or when we are.
Let's split up and look for clues.
Hey, could I ask you what year it is?
Why, yes, it's 1965.
Interesting. Can I ask you a few more questions? Yeah, that sounds groovy. What's going on right now? Well, since today is Earth Day, everyone is celebrating the Earth because we love our planet so much. That sounds swell. Where I come from, people don't really see the connection between their actions and the environment. That's sad. I love the environment. In fact, right now I'm campaigning with the Sierra Club, an environmental organization. We're trying to prevent the construction of a dam in Glen Canyon, which, while providing water to the southwest, would drown out one of the country's most beautiful landscapes and destroy the ecosystem. Luckily, me and all my friends feel very strongly about this. We hope that by the 1980s and the 1990s, we can have fixed most of the problems that the Earth faces due to human actions. Me too. Thank you. Peace out.
So what did you learn?
A lot. My guess is that we're in the 1960s. What do you think?
Same as you, 1965 to be exact. Did you learn anything new?
A lot. I learned that in the 60s, there was a lot more awareness of the connection between human actions and the environment.
Wow, interesting. You remember when Exxon spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound? They haven't even heard about that since it happened in the 80s.
Time is crazy. What do you say we get back in the time machine and head home?
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to save the Earth. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, rather than trying to reform or tweak the environmental regulations that came into play in the 60s, tried to reverse them entirely. The morals of the environmental movement prevalent in the 60s did not line up with those of the new Republicans of the 80s.
I come home in the morning light, my mother says, when you gonna live your life right? On my day we're not the fortunate ones, and girls, they wanna have fun. Whoa, girls just wanna have fun.
Whoa. Greetings, I'm Gillette Swanson.
And my name is Carl Burton. Tonight's special takes us on a trip back into time.
Straight from the 60s.
To the 80s.
During the 60s, the United States was plagued with racial issues. America's black population fought for equality through a movement now known as the Civil Rights Movement.
That's all. Those of you who are white, you have many white leaders who can speak for you. You have many whites in power who have the billions and trillions.
One widely recognized figure of the 60s movement was Martin Luther King Jr.
Just as I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Countless civil rights leaders sacrificed their lives to ensure a better future for this nation. The movement was often met with resistance and encountered many ups and downs. To only mention one of many casualties, Emmett Till, a black teenager, was brutally lynched in Mississippi for whistling at a white woman. The murder shocked the nation and caused more anger within the civil rights movement. The men were not charged. Many civil rights leaders preached nonviolent forms of protest, such as sit-ins. This form of peaceful protest became very popular in the 60s. A group of black men and women would walk into a whites-only lunch counter and sit down. This angered many whites, leading a lot of the protesters to get attacked during the protest. No matter what happened, they always tried their best to stay calm and peaceful. Still, many were badly injured and arrested. Other civil rights leaders, however, took a more hands-on approach. In whatever manner they proceeded, the civil rights movement shaped the legacy of the present-day America. The time travel virus seems to be spreading over to you, Carl. How did the civil rights movement evolve and change in the 80s?
Oh wow, I can finally get away from the children. Hey Gillette, I seem to be in the 80s, and well, the civil rights movement has not slowed down. Civil rights in the 80s included movements such as anti-nuclear groups, gay rights activists, women's rights, and animal rights. These protests sought to give a wide array of people the rights given to them by the Constitution. More and more people got involved in speaking out for their beliefs, and there were an increasing number of protests for various causes. While the 60s focused primarily on America's racial divide, the 80s provided more equality and opportunities for the black community while advocating for newer civil rights issues. Additionally, while the 60s movement's goal was to remain peaceful, Many 80s protests ended up in violent altercation. That reflects the evolution of the American spirit.
It seems like the 60s definitely impacted the movements of the 80s.
Yeah, and it looks like these movements really shaped the America we see today.
We still have improvements to make, but these past movements are so inspiring and bring me lots of hope for the future of the country.
We're no strangers to love. You know the rules, and so do I.
It's time now to tune in and talk about news.
That's right. Today we are discussing how news evolved and changed between the 60s and the 80s.
Picture the 60s, when television news was just coming on to the scene. America could now watch news events from the comfort of their living rooms, as opposed to sitting crowded around a radio. Televised news brought events such as civil rights protests, presidential debates, and the Vietnam War to screens across the country.
Alternatively, during the 1980s, television, along with magazines, established itself as the dominant form of news media.
Media companies began to merge to focus on stocks and money, showing that America was moving away from the loose ideologies of the 60s and hippie movement.
With the nonconformity of the 60s came a push not to blindly accept what was presented on TV. This brought a wave of criticism of the press as a whole, as well as more awareness of biases in the news.
During the 60s, the main three news companies that held the monopoly over news broadcasting were ABC, NBC, and CBS, otherwise known as the Big Three.
However, as the 80s introduced rival companies to the Big Three, such as Fox News and CNN. Started in 1980, CNN gained popularity because it was one of the first 24-hour news shows. It reported on international issues such as war and crises abroad.
In the 60s, the dominant form of broadcasting was network TV, which utilized public airways to allow channels to reach household TVs. The problem with this system was that it only gave viewers a limited choice of channels, and it couldn't reach places with poor reception.
These issues sparked the invention of cable TV in the 1980s. Cable TV is based on subscription and works through fiber optic cables rather than public airways. It expanded to reach areas that couldn't reach network television. Cable was immediately favored by the public due to its greater range of channels and broader reach.
The resistance to blind faith in news companies during the 60s spurred on a movement called news journalism, which reflected the zeitgeist of the era by branching off from normal news structure in form of literary techniques and first-person accounts of events.
The introduction of televised news in the 60s also helped bring awareness to social activism movements such as civil rights, as well as American politics and foreign affairs. It gave civil rights leaders a way to share their views and brought the injustice of segregation and discrimination to citizens by showing recorded demonstrations and strikes.
The U.S. television industry also received $2 billion in advertising, twice that of radios. American cigarette advertising contributed to a large part of that. It showed how the public was beginning to become more money-oriented and demonstrated the rise of marketing on TV.
This trend continued into the 80s with a growing form of advertisement, sponsorship, and branding. Sports stars and well-known figures began being paid millions for their endorsement, raising the cost of the products they endorsed.
The 60s didn't often use celebrities as a marketing technique, but TV personalities such as Walter Cronkite were idolized and recognized as national icons. Unfortunately, women were not very well represented on television until the 80s, when feminism began to carry onto the media with Oprah Winfrey, Connie Chung, and Barbara Walters.
Oprah Winfrey's show, AM Chicago, obtained higher ratings than other popular morning shows hosted by men. The Oprah Winfrey Show rose to popularity very quickly since it discussed controversial issues and gave a more personal outlook on these problems.
The 60s was a time of new technology and newly emerging businesses. Big corporations monetized on the new form of media, while the American public began to criticize and scrutinize biases in the news.
The 80s brought about television's dominance of the news industry and a host of new, smaller broadcasting companies rivaling the previously formed monopolies. With it came technology to expand the reach of news and an increase of gender and racial representation on television.
I think we covered it all.
Yeah, our job here's done.
Well, take it up, baby, now. Take it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, come on, come on, come on, baby, now.
What am I wearing? This is Exactly what my English teacher wore for the 60s, 70s, and 80s Literature Day. It seems like I'm in a publishing company. Dated January 1985, at least that's what the sign says. But it looks recent, huh? Look at all these books. They look like they're all from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye. I learned about it in English class. I remember that it centers around themes of racism, I think, and classism. I remember this was Toni Morrison's first book that a lot of people loved, but she also got a lot of criticism because it was really dark. So it was published in 1970, I think, and this book, To Kill a Mockingbird, which is on the shelf, is also about racism and classism. It was written in 1960 and reads like it. Only a decade before the other one, but the narratives are very different. This must be the nonfiction section. I see a lot of books here that my English teacher always raves about for their old-fashioned storytelling, but also the way that they really reflect on current societal events. I think that the 60s and 80s was a period of honesty in literature, now that I think about it all. Most of the books going into the 70s were reflecting on the 60s, and vice versa for the 70s and 80s. It seems as if this time period really started the contemporary movement. It really showed a new phase of authors and poets talking about dreams, hopes, and fears. The face of American literature had begun to change in this time period to nonfiction novels about current events, but also reflections and about how society and individuals are taking this all. American literature today must have been super impacted by all these changes. I think I read somewhere that even today, the impressions made on literature in this time period still apply to the 21st century. One specific example would be the Beat movement. It was short-lived, starting and ending in the 1950s, but had a lasting influence on American poetry during the contemporary period. Allen Ginsberg's Howl pushed aside the formal, largely traditional poetic conventions that had come to dominate American poetry. Raucous, profane, and deeply moving. Howl reset Americans' expectations for poetry during the second half of the 20th century and beyond, and those principles still apply today. Altogether, the ideas that they had in the 60s that evolved throughout the 70s and 80s, and sometimes they changed a whole lot. Some of the ideals from back then got entirely lost in translation, and lots of things are still the same, as literature today clearly shows.